There are things the land knows that the rest of the world never gets around to asking. It holds them quietly, the way a well holds water, dark and deep and patient, waiting for the one who still knows how to draw the rope down far enough to reach the truth. I know that now. I didn't know it the morning they handed me an envelope at my father's while reading and told me, with the casual cruelty of people who have never once worried about where they would sleep, that I had inherited a farmhouse worth $9. $9. My brother Caleb smiled when he heard it. Not a big smile. Just enough. My sister Renata kept her eyes on the table, which was its own kind of smile. The lawyer, a thin man named Gerald Holt, whose suit was the color of old dishwater, read the number from the document the way a man reads an expiration date on something he's already decided to throw away. I sat very still. I had learned to sit still in that family. It was the only kind of armor I had ever owned. My name is Miriam. I am the one who stayed. Section 1, The Farmer's Silent World. I need you to understand something about the Decker family farm before I tell you what happened at the will reading, before I explain what $9 really means, and before I walk you through what my father buried inside those walls for me. You need to understand the land first. Decker Farm sits on 214 acres in the hill country of central Tennessee, tucked between a ridge of limestone bluffs and a creek called Bone Run that has never run dry in recorded memory. My grandfather, Walter Decker, bought those 214 acres in 1961 with money he had been saving since he was 19 years old, folding bills into a coffee can he kept under a floorboard in his rented room. He paid $4,100 for the whole parcel, and he told my father on the day they walked it together. My father was 11 years old and wearing boots 2 sizes too large, that the land was not an investment. It was a covenant. You don't own land like this, he told my father. You serve it. My grandfather grew hay and kept beef cattle and ran a small apple orchard along the south-facing slope above the creek. He worked from before light until after dark for 32 years, and when he died of a heart attack in 1993, alone in the barn on a February morning with a halter in his hand. The farm was paid for. The cattle were healthy, and there was $17,000 in a savings account that nobody in the family had known about. My father was 43 when Walter died. He inherited everything, and to his credit, he tried. He kept the cattle for a while. He kept the hay operation going for nearly a decade. But my father was not a man built for patience, and farming is almost entirely patience. It is planting in March and not seeing a return until August. It is watching a good calf take sick and doing everything right and losing it anyway. It is trust, ongoing, unguaranteed trust in a process you cannot fully control. My father preferred control. By the time I was old enough to understand what I was seeing, the farm had begun its slow contraction. The south orchard went first. Too much labor for what return, my father said, and he was not wrong about the math. The orchard went a bramble and then to scrub cedar, and the deer moved in, and the deer were beautiful, but they were not income. Then half the cattle herd was sold to cover a debt he didn't explain. Then a piece of the back acreage, 40 acres along the ridge, was quietly leased to a logging company for a single lump sum that seemed large in a moment and was gone within a year. I watched all of this happen. I watched it the way you watch a crack in a wall get wider, slowly at first, then with a kind of terrible momentum. I stayed because the land needed someone to stay. I want to be clear about what I mean. I did not stay out of obligation or guilt or because I had no other options. I had options. I had a degree in agricultural science from the University of Tennessee. I had 2 job offers the year I graduated, one from an agricultural extension office in Memphis and one from a seed company based in Nashville. I turned both of them down. I stayed because of something my grandfather had told me when I was 9 years old and following him along the fence line on the east pasture while he looked for a gap that the yearling bull had found. He stopped at the top of the rise where you could see the whole farm laid out below, the house and the barn and the hay fields, and, in the distance, the pale ghost of the old orchard. And he said, without looking at me, as if he were saying it mostly to himself, most people look at a piece of ground and see what it is. The ones who matter look at it and see what it's trying to become. You're one of the ones who matter, Miriam. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I was 9. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I felt it the way you feel a truth that is too large for your current vocabulary. I felt in my chest, behind my sternum, warm and solid in mine. I stayed for that feeling. For 12 years after I finished my degree, I ran the working portions of Decker Farm. I brought the hay operation back to full production. I rebuilt the cattle herd from 60 head to over 120. I secured a crop share arrangement with a neighboring farm for the acreage my father had leased out, and when the lease expired, I negotiated its return. I applied for and received 3 USDA Conservation Program payments that provided reliable income during 2 drought years that would otherwise have broken us. My siblings did not do these things. Caleb lived in Nashville, where he worked in commercial real estate, and he came home for Thanksgiving and sometimes Christmas, and occasionally for a summer weekend when he wanted to show his children what a farm looked like. Renata lived in Knoxville, where she sold high-end kitchen cabinetry, and she came home slightly less often than Caleb, and always left slightly sooner. Neither of them ever drove a tractor on that farm. Neither of them ever pulled a calf at 2 a.m. in January. Neither of them knew that the well pump in the south barn had a pressure switch that needed to be reset by hand every February because the cold made it sluggish, or that the gate on the east pasture had a latch that would stick in wet weather and had to be lifted at a particular angle, or that there was a low spot in the hay field near the creek that would take water during a hard rain and needed to be checked within 24 hours or the alfalfa would mold. I knew these things. I knew them the way you know your own body. The farm was my body, in a way. It had become that integrated with who I was. My father knew that I knew. I believe he was proud of it, in his way. He was not an expressive man, and his pride wore the shape of quiet reliance. He relied on me completely and without acknowledgement, which I suppose is one definition of trust, even if it is an imperfect one. We worked alongside each other for years in a state of near total mutual understanding and almost no direct communication about anything that mattered. But there was one afternoon 2 years before he died when we were fixing a section of fence along the north property line, and he stopped working and straightened up and looked out across the field for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "I know what this place owes you." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. He bent back to the fence post and drove the staple home, and that was that. I have thought about that sentence every single day since he said it. My father died in October of last year. He had been sick for 18 months, a cancer that started in his pancreas, and moved with the patient. Methodical thoroughness of something that is all the time in the world. He managed a farm in his mind long after his body gave out, asking me questions about the cattle weights and the hay yield and the water table in the south field. Lie in a hospital bed that hospice had set up in the living room, his voice thin, but his interest undimmed. He died on a Tuesday morning while I was in the barn. I have no guilt about not being with him at that moment. I think he would have preferred it that way. I think he wanted me where he always wanted me, with the land, working, keeping things going. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral, in the living room of the farmhouse, with Gerald Holt sitting at the kitchen table with his briefcase and his dishwater suit, and my brother Caleb and my sister Renata arranged on the sofa, like people who have already decided how they feel about an outcome. I sat in my grandfather's old chair in the corner. It is a Windsor chair with a cracked spindle that I have been meaning to fix for 15 years. I sat in it, and I put my hands in my lap, and I waited. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gerald Holt read the document in full, the way lawyers do, with the particular airlessness of a man, reciting rather than communicating. The farm, all 214 acres, the house, the barn, the equipment, the cattle herd, the hay operation, everything I had spent 12 years building, was to be divided equally between Caleb and Renata. My share was a single-line item near the bottom of the document. The original farmhouse structure and the land immediately surrounding it, comprising approximately 1/3 of 1 acre, was left to me. The assessed value of that structure, according to the most recent county property record, was $9. The house had been separately assessed from the surrounding farm acreage during a property tax adjustment my father had apparently requested several years earlier. The structure itself, being old and in need of significant repair, had been assigned a nominal value, $9. Caleb and Renata received the farm, the equipment, the cattle, and the hay income. I received an old house on a third of an acre that was worth, on paper, less than a cheap dinner. Gerald Holt closed the document. No one said my name. Section 2. The toxic figure arrives. My brother Caleb is not a bad man. I want to be honest about that, because the story I am telling you is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a man who had convinced himself for so long that he was an important one, that he had simply stopped examining that belief. Entitlement is not always loud. Sometimes it is very, very quiet, and it lives in the gaps, in the way a man doesn't ask about the work you've done, in the way a decision gets made without your name being included in the conversation, in the way a smile appears at exactly the wrong moment. Caleb's smile at the will reading was a smile of a man confirming something he had long expected. It was not triumphant. It was satisfied. The satisfaction of a verdict rendered in accordance with a verdict he had already reached. He had been building toward this for years. For months before my father died, when it became clear that the end was approaching, Caleb had started calling my father more frequently, not to help. There was nothing practical Caleb could have done for the farm, and he knew it, but to talk. Long conversations that my father would report to me in fragments. Caleb thinks we should look at the cattle market before winter. Caleb has a contact who does estate planning. Caleb says the back acreage might be worth more than we think if the county rezoning goes through. I listened to these fragments without comment. My father was dying, and he needed to feel that his children were interested in the future of what he had built. If Caleb's interests wore the shape of positioning for inheritance, that was between Caleb and his own conscience. But I noticed that Renata had begun calling more frequently, too. Renata is 8 years older than me and is always related to the farm the way a person relates to a child at home they were glad to leave, fondly, from a distance, with no intention of returning. But in those final months, she had developed a sudden, specific interest in the property valuations. She had a friend who was a real estate attorney in Knoxville. She mentioned this fact more than once. The day after the will reading, Caleb pulled me aside in the kitchen, while Renata and Gerald Holt were going over paperwork at the table. "I want you to know that Renata and I talked about this," he said. He had the look of a man delivering a decision he had dressed up as a conversation. "We think it's only fair that you have until spring to make arrangements." I looked at him. "To vacate the farmhouse," he said, "since you'll be living there, technically, but the surrounding property is ours. We'll need to consolidate things, get someone in who can properly manage the operation going forward. You're going to hire a farm manager." I said, "We're looking at options." He said this the way he said everything, with the confidence of a man who had never had to wonder whether his plans would work out. "You've done great work here, Miriam. Nobody is saying otherwise. But we need to think about what makes sense going forward." I looked out the kitchen window at the south field. The hay was cut and baled and stacked, ready for winter. I had done that. I had done all of it. "I'll need some time," I said. "Of course," he said. "That's why I said spring." Renata from the table. "We're trying to be fair, Miriam. We really are." I thanked them for their consideration, and went outside and walked to the barn and stood among the cattle for a while. The cattle didn't know anything had changed. They regarded me with their enormous, patient eyes and went on being cattle. The will reading had been on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, I had noticed Caleb walking the property with a man I didn't recognize. City shoes, clipboard, measuring tape. They walked the east pasture and the hay fields and the area around the barn. Caleb was talking and gesturing, and the man with the clipboard was writing things down. I watched them from the barn door. Renata came and stood beside me. She had a cup of coffee that she had made from the kitchen of my house. The house that was now technically mine, though surrounded entirely by property that was theirs. "That's a development consultant," she said without preamble. "Caleb's been talking to him for a few months. There's a firm interested in the property. They want to do a rural retreat concept. Glamping, that kind of thing. Leave the house as a centerpiece feature." I turned and looked at her. "You get to keep your $9 of house," she said, almost kindly. "They'd probably even pay you something for the inconvenience. Caleb's working on the numbers." I looked back at the man with the clipboard. He had stopped in the middle of the east pasture and was making a slow circle with his arm, indicating something. a view, a layout, a vision that had nothing to do with hay or cattle or the quiet work of keeping a piece of ground alive. My grandfather is buried at the edge of that field, I said. Renata was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Then, softer, the cemetery plot would be preserved. Naturally. I went back inside and sat down at my kitchen table, in the house that was mine, on land that surrounded it in every direction and belonged to someone else. And I thought about what my father had said to me 2 years earlier, straightening up at the fence line, looking out across the field. I know what this place owes you. He had known, and he had written the will anyway, and I had spent 3 days trying to understand that, turning it over in my mind the way you turn a stone over with your boot to see what's underneath. Why would a man who knew what the land owed his daughter leave her $9? I was about to find out. Section 3. The public humiliation. The gathering happened on a Sunday, 8 days after the will reading. Caleb had organized it. A family meeting, he called it, with Gerald Holt present to answer any legal questions, and 2 additional parties who arrived in a single car, a woman named Patricia Cross, who introduced herself as a rural property development specialist, and a man named Drew Hargrove who worked for an investment group called Ridgeline Partners, LLC. My aunt and uncle came, my father's younger brother, Earl, and his wife, Donna. They had driven up from Alabama. They sat at the far end of the table with the particular careful stillness of people who have guessed something is about to happen and are not certain they want to witness it. I sat at the table, too. Nobody had told me not to. Caleb ran the meeting the way he ran things in his professional life, with projected confidence and a sequence of prepared points. He had printed materials. For an inheritance meeting at our family's kitchen table, on paper with the Ridgeline Partners logo in the upper corner. The proposal, as presented, was as follows. Ridgeline Partners would purchase the farm, the land, the cattle, the equipment, the operation, for $1.4 million. The glamping retreat concept Patricia Cross described was sophisticated and carefully positioned. She used words like experiential agriculture and heritage tourism and passive income stream. She had photographs of similar developments in other rural markets. The photographs were beautiful. Rolling hills and restored barns and smiling people sitting in Adirondack chairs with drinks in their hands. My grandfather's 214 acres turned into a backdrop for people who want to feel rural, without being rural. The deal was structured to close by the end of the year, which was approximately 11 weeks away. Caleb and Renata would split the proceeds. Gerald Holt confirmed the legal arrangement was sound. Then Caleb looked at me. "We want to be fair to you, Miriam," he said. "Ridgeline is prepared to offer you a settlement for voluntary relocation from the farmhouse. The number they've authorized me to share is $25,000. Patricia Cross nodded warmly, as if $25,000 were a gift. "That's a generous number," Renata said, "given the assessed value." I looked down at the table. The surface of that table was something I had been cleaning for 12 years. I had refinished it 6 years ago with linseed oil, working in sections, letting it soak in. The grain was clear and warm beneath the overhead light. My Uncle Earl cleared his throat. "What does Miriam get if she doesn't take the settlement?" "She keeps her house," Caleb said, "on a third of an acre, surrounded by resort development. Presumably that's not a realistic long-term option." "Presumably," I said. Everyone looked at me. I had been quiet for so long that my voice seemed to surprise them. "I'm not going to take the settlement," I said, "and I'm not going to be relocated." Caleb's expression did not change, exactly, but something behind it shifted. "Miriam." "I'm also not finished," I said. Renata set her coffee cup down. Patricia Cross looked at Drew Hargrove. Gerald Holt looked at his papers. "I want to say something to you, Caleb, and to you, Renata, in front of the people in this room, because I think it matters that it be said in front of witnesses." I kept my voice level. My grandfather had been level in all things, and I had learned it from him. I have worked this farm for 12 years. I have been the entire operation. Not part of it, all of it. Every animal, every acre, every repair, every application, every decision about what this land grows and what it becomes. I have done that in the expectation that this place would remain what it is. A farm, something alive, something that serves the land instead of consuming it. I paused. You are within your legal rights to sell it. I said, I understand that. I'm not here to argue the legal question. I picked up my coffee cup and drank the last of it, set it down carefully. I just wanted you to know that I know what this farm is, and I am not going to sign anything today. Caleb leaned back. You don't have anything to sign. We don't need your signature. I know you don't, I said. My Aunt Donna was looking at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something between sorrow and something else. Something like recognition. I stood up, thanked Gerald Holt for his time, nodded to Patricia Cross and Drew Hargrove, and went outside. I stood on the porch of the house that was mine and looked at the land that surrounded it and felt, for the first time in my adult life, completely alone on this farm. But I also felt, under the aloneness, like a current under cold water, something else. My father had known what the farm owed me. He had said so, and he had been specific about it. He had said the farm owed me, not that he owed me, not that Caleb or Renata owed me, the land itself. Why would a man who understood land the way my father had understood it, imperfectly, yes, but with genuine feeling, why would that man leave the question of what the land owed me inside the land itself? I went back into the house, and I started looking. Section 4, the investigation. The farmhouse at Decker Farm was built in 1923 by my great-grandfather, Harris Decker, who had learned carpentry from his own father, and who built things to outlast the opinions of everyone who ever told him his plans were too ambitious. The house has 2 stories, a root cellar, a wraparound porch on 3 sides, a stone foundation, and walls that are 18 inches thick in the old way, with air cavities between the interior plaster and the exterior board. 18-inch walls hold things. Anyone who has ever lived in an old house knows this. Things fall behind baseboards and slip between joists and disappear into cavities and get forgotten. The house remembers them even when the people don't. I had lived in this house my entire life. I knew it the way I knew the farm, intimately, in the specific, sensory way of someone who has cleaned and repaired and inhabited every inch of it. I knew where the floors creaked and where the plaster had been patched and where my grandfather had carved his initials into a door frame at the back of the pantry. W. 1962, the year after he built the cattle barn. I started in the root cellar because my father had spent time in the root cellar in the last 2 years of his life, not doing physical work. He couldn't by then, but sitting. I would find him down there sometimes in the evening, just sitting on the old wooden bench in the corner, not doing anything that I could identify. When I asked him about it, he said he liked the smell. The root cellar smelled like earth and wood, and the ghosts of 100 years of preserves. I went through it methodically, moving jars and boxes and the old wooden vegetable bins my grandmother had built in the 1970s. Nothing. The walls were bare stone. The floor was packed dirt. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. I went upstairs. I went through the room that had been my grandfather's study, a small room at the back of the second floor, with a single window that looked out over the north field. My father had used it, too, for his paperwork, his farm ledgers, the filing cabinet that contained 40 years of agricultural records. The filing cabinet was still there. Caleb and Renata had not yet removed anything from a house. They were operating with the casual confidence of people who believe time is on their side. I went through the filing cabinet. Farm ledgers going back to 1971. Tax records, equipment manuals, veterinary receipts, USDA program documents, soil survey reports from the county extension office, and then, in the back of the bottom drawer, behind a manila folder of seed catalogs from the 1980s, something that was not a farm record. A legal-size envelope sealed with my name on the front in my father's handwriting. Not Miriam. Not Miriam Decker. Just Miriam, in the particular, slightly cramped script he used when he was being careful, when he wanted it to be clear. I sat down on the floor of that small room with the window, looking out over the north field, and I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter, for pages handwritten on a yellow legal pad paper my father had used for everything important, and a second sealed envelope, this one smaller, with the words for the county, delivered a register of deeds written on the front. I read the letter first. My father's voice came off the page so clearly that it stopped my breath. Miriam, if you are reading this, Then the will has been read, and you know what I left you. $9. I imagine that landed hard. I imagine Caleb smiled. I know your sister looked at the table. I need you to understand something before I explain the rest. I did not leave you $9 because I valued you at $9. I left you $9 because $9 was the least threatening number I could find, and I needed the wolves to underestimate what they were looking at. Your grandfather taught me that. He said, never let a man know what a field is worth until you're ready for him to know. Show him the weeds, not the water table. I had to stop reading for a moment. My vision had blurred. I breathed. I looked out the window at the north field, at the hay stubble left from the last cutting, at the limestone ridge beyond it that turns gold in the late afternoon. Then I kept reading. My father explained in 4 pages of careful, deliberate handwriting, something that he had done 18 years ago, shortly after my grandfather's death, when my father had been going through Walter Decker's papers. My grandfather had been quiet about many things. He had been quiet, it turned out, about the most important thing of all. In 1978, a geological survey team contracted by a Nashville-based energy company had approached my grandfather about conducting a subsurface mineral assessment on Decker Farm. My grandfather had agreed, on the condition that any mineral rights discovered would be retained separately from the surface deed. The energy company had agreed. The arrangement had been recorded at the County Register of Deeds in 1979 in a document that listed Walter James Decker as the holder of all subsurface mineral rights to the 214-acre parcel. The surface of the land and the minerals beneath it had been legally separated for 45 years. When my grandfather died in 1993, his estate passed to my father, but the mineral rights document, a separate recorded deed, filed under a different instrument number from the surface deed, had sat in a folder in my grandfather's filing cabinet, unmentioned, unreviewed, and eventually forgotten beneath decades of seed catalogs. My father found it 18 years ago, and then he did something that I had to read 3 times before I fully understood. He had the mineral rights document reviewed by a property attorney in Chattanooga, not Gerald Holt. Some of my father had found specifically because he had no prior connection to family. The attorney confirmed that the mineral rights were valid, separately recorded, and entirely intact. They had never been included in any of the property transactions or lease agreements over the intervening decades. They had never been mentioned to Caleb or Renata. They had never appeared in any of the estate planning documents Gerald Holt had prepared, because my father had then done something else entirely. He had amended the mineral rights deed. Quietly, legally, without fanfare, he had recorded a new document at the County Register of Deeds, transferring the subsurface mineral rights to the 214-acre Decker farm parcel, all of them in perpetuity, to one Miriam Jean Decker, me. The recording date on that document was November 14th, 11 years ago, on what would have been my grandfather's 82nd birthday. My father had been holding this for 11 years, waiting. The second sealed envelope, the one addressed to the County Register of Deeds, contained a notarized letter from my father's Chattanooga attorney, confirming the chain of title and providing specific instrument numbers for both the original 1979 mineral rights recording and the subsequent transfer to my name. I sat on the floor of my grandfather's study for a very long time. Outside, the north field was going gold in the afternoon light. The ridge beyond it was turning the color of old honey. A hawk was working the updraft along the limestone face, tilting and banking in absolute silence. My father had known what the land owed me. He had put it there himself, in the place where it could not be taken. Section 5, the solution. The next morning, I drove to the county seat. The Register of Deeds office is on the second floor of the courthouse, and it is staffed by a woman named Beverly Oakes who has worked there for 31 years, and who has a particular quality of a person who has processed so many documents that she experiences the entire legal landscape of human relations with a certain serene, unsurprisable calm. I set the sealed envelope on her counter and told her I had a document to file and a recording to verify. Beverly Oakes opened the envelope, reviewed the attorney's letter, and pulled up the county's digital record system. She typed in the first instrument number, the 1979 mineral rights recording, and turned her screen toward me. Walter James Decker. Mineral rights, all subsurface. 214 acres. Instrument number 79-04471. Recorded November 3rd, 1979. She typed the second instrument number. Miriam Jean Decker. Mineral rights transfer from estate of Warren Allen Decker. 214 acres. Instrument number 08-11142. Recorded November 14th, 11 years ago. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "This is your recording," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "And you're aware," she said, and she said it with a careful precision of someone who understands exactly what she is about to say, that the parcel associated with this recording is currently in the process of a surface deed transfer? "I am," I said. She nodded slowly. The surface deed transfer doesn't affect subsurface mineral rights. They're separately recorded instruments. The surface can change hands 17 times, and the mineral rights stay exactly where they are. "I know," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Is there anything you'd like me to pull for you? A certified copy of both recordings?" "Please," I said. "And I'd like to know if there have been any recent mineral assessments on this parcel." Beverly Oaks typed for a few minutes. Then she turned the screen toward me again. There had been one recent assessment, conducted 18 months ago, commissioned by Ridgeline Partners, LLC, as part of their due diligence on the property acquisition. The assessment report was a public record. Beverly printed me a copy. I sat in the courthouse parking lot and read the Ridgeline Partners mineral assessment report. Beneath Decker Farm, at a depth of approximately 1,800 feet, there was a natural gas formation, not enormous, not the kind of discovery that makes headlines, but significant. The assessment estimated recoverable reserves with projected royalty value over a 20-year production period of between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on market conditions. Ridgeline Partners had known about this. They had commissioned the assessment. They had the results. And they had made an offer on the surface property, an offer that included the implied assumption that a resort development would be their primary use, without ever mentioning to Caleb or Renata that there was a natural gas formation beneath the land, because they knew, or their attorneys knew, that mineral rights are often separated from surface rights in older Tennessee properties. They had done their due diligence, and their due diligence had probably told them that the mineral rights on this parcel were recorded separately. What their due diligence had apparently not uncovered, or had uncovered and ignored, betting that I wouldn't know, was that those mineral rights now belong to me. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I drove back to the farm. Caleb's car was in the driveway. He had come back on a Monday, which was unusual for him. And when I walked in the front door, he was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-eaten sandwich in front of him, doing something that involved a lot of clicking and occasional muttering. "I need to speak to you," I said. He looked up with the faintly impatient expression of a man who is in the middle of something. "Can it wait? I'm on a timeline with some documents for the closing." "It cannot wait," I said. Something in my tone made him stop clicking. He looked at me fully for the first time in 8 days. I set the certified copies of both mineral rights recordings on the table in front of him. I set the Ridgeline Partners mineral assessment report next to them. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. He looked at the papers again. "What is this?" he said. "Read the first page." I said. He did. I watched his face while he read. I have thought a lot about what I saw there, and I want to be honest about it rather than satisfying. It was not the collapse of a villain. It was a confusion of a man who genuinely had not known, who had been told or had assumed or had not thought to ask, that the land was simpler than it was. The confusion gave way to something else as he read further. A redness at the edge of his collar, a stillness in his hands. He set the papers down. "These are real," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man confirming a reality he wished were different. "Certified copies from the Register of Deeds." I said, "The originals have been on file for 45 years and 11 years respectively. Beverly Oaks can confirm everything." He was quiet for a long time. "Dad knew about this," he said finally. "Yes." "And he gave it to you." 11 years ago. I said, "The same year you sold your share of grandfather's equipment." He looked at the window. Outside, The north field was catching the morning light, the hay stubble silver gold and still. The mineral rights don't transfer with the surface deed, I said. Whatever Ridgeline Partners buys, they're buying the surface. The gas formation stays with me. He put both hands flat on the table. Ridgeline Partners knew about the gas formation, I said. They commissioned the assessment 18 months ago. I have a copy of the report. Their offer to buy this property, their offer to you and Renata, was made with full knowledge of those reserves and without disclosure. Caleb closed his eyes. You need to call Renata, I said, and then you need to call Gerald Holt. And then I think all three of you need to have a very careful conversation with whoever has been representing Ridgeline Partners in this transaction. I picked up the papers and held them against my chest. I'm going to go check the cattle, I said. Take your time. Section 6, the breakdown. Renata arrived that afternoon. She must have driven straight from Knoxville. She was there within 3 hours of Caleb's call, which told me something about the velocity of Caleb's distress when he reached her. She came in the front door without knocking, which was old habit, and found Caleb still at the kitchen table, the papers in front of him, his laptop closed now. He had been sitting there when I came back from the cattle, and he had not moved much in the intervening hours. Renata read the documents. She read them twice, more slowly the second time, in the way people read things they hope to find a different meaning in on the second pass. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked at me. I was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, leaning against the frame the way I had leaned against it since I was a child. It is an old house, and the frame is solid and warm, and it has held my weight 1,000 times. He did this on purpose, Renata said. Not accusatory, exactly. More like the flat recognition of a fact that refuses to be anything else. Yes, I said. Why didn't he tell us? The question was aimed at Caleb, not at me, but Caleb didn't have an answer. I did. I had been thinking about it since I read the letter. Because you would have contested it, I said. If he had sat down with all three of us and said that he was transferring the mineral rights to Miriam, you would have gone to Gerald Holt or to another attorney, and you would have found ground to challenge it. But a recording that's been sitting in the county files for 11 years, with a clean chain of title going back to 1979, with grandfather's original signature on the first instrument, that's not contestable. He made it uncontestable before he told any of us about it. Renata's jaw was tight. He was protecting you, she said. There was something raw in her voice. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was something in between. Yes, I said. From us, she said. I didn't answer that. The silence in the kitchen was different from all the silences that had come before it. It had weight. It had shape. It was the shape of a question that Renata was asking herself, and that Caleb was asking himself, and that I had been living with for years in a different form. What had they actually known about this farm? About what it took to keep it alive? About the person who had done the keeping? Caleb spoke first, and when he spoke his voice was rough in the way that voices get when something has been stripped from them. I told the developer it was a clean acquisition, he said. He was not talking to me. He was talking to the papers on the table, or to the window, or to some version of himself that he was already beginning to grieve. I told them the mineral situation was straightforward. They sent me the assessment report, and he stopped. I didn't read it carefully. I saw the reserve estimates, and I thought they were just being thorough. I didn't know they were. He stopped again. They were planning to renegotiate. I said quietly, once the sale closed, once the surface deed had transferred, and they owned the land, they were planning to approach whoever held the mineral rights, which they assumed was still part of the estate, and they were going to offer a nominal royalty deal in exchange for drilling rights, a deal that would have seemed generous to people who didn't know the value of what was under the ground. Caleb looked at me. His face had the particular blankness of a man who has just understood that he was not the sophisticated party in a transaction he thought he controlled. They were going to use you, I said, and then they were going to use the gas to finance the resort. And the resort was the pretty part, the part they told you about. The gas was the part they kept to themselves. Renata sat down at the table. She sat down heavily, the way people sit when their legs decide before their mind does. We almost sold grandmother's land to people who were robbing us, she said. Yes, I said. She put her hands over her face. I let the silence sit. I had learned from my grandfather that silence after a true thing is important. It needs room. It needs to be allowed to be what it is before anyone tries to cover it with words. After a while, Renata took her hands away from her face. Her eyes were red. She looked at me across the kitchen table. Across the table, I had refinished with linseed oil, in the house we had all grown up in, on the land that had held all of our childhoods and our grandfather's life work, and our father's quiet, final act of fidelity. You knew, she said, when they read the will, you knew what Dad had done. No, I said, I found out the day after the family meeting. But you didn't say anything at the meeting. No. Why not? I thought about how to answer that, honestly. Because I needed to know what you would do with the farm before I decided what to do with what I knew. I said, if you had been planning to keep it running, if you had wanted to keep it as a working farm, to find someone who would respect what it is, then maybe there was a different conversation to have. But you brought in a resort developer. You were planning to pave over grandfather's pastures and put people in Adirondack chairs where the cattle used to graze. That's not. Renata started, then stopped. It's what was, I said gently. I'm not angry about it. I understand it. You don't love this land the way I do. You never lived with it the way I did. That's not a character flaw. It's just the truth. Caleb was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in a long time, maybe ever. It was the expression of a man who is genuinely trying to see someone he has been looking past for years. What do you want? He said. What is it you actually want? It was the first time, in 38 years of being his sister, that he had asked me that directly. Section 7, the new stewardship. What I wanted was not complicated. It had never been complicated. Complicated was what happened when people with no connection to a place tried to extract value from it. What I wanted was simple enough to fit inside a single sentence. I wanted the farm to remain a farm. Here is what I proposed in the week that followed, with a new attorney present, not Gerald Holt, but a woman named Caroline Marsh from Cookville who specializes in agricultural property law and who has a reputation of being someone you want on your side when land is at stake. The surface sale to Ridgeline Partners was to be withdrawn immediately. Caleb and Renata had legal grounds to void the transaction, given the material omission of the mineral rights situation in Ridgeline's disclosure documents. Caroline Marsh's assessment was that they had a strong case. Ridgeline Partners, when informed of this assessment, did not contest the withdrawal. They folded quietly, which is what entities fold when they know they were caught at something. The farm would be restructured as a family agricultural trust with a 50-year term. The trust will hold the surface acreage, all 214 acres, and the management of the trust will be formally vested in me, with an annual reporting obligation to Caleb and Renata as beneficiaries. They would receive income distributions from farm operations, proportionate to their share of the surface deed. My mineral rights will remain separate, held in my name, not in the trust. Any future development of the subsurface resources would be my decision, under my terms, with lease agreements negotiated by an energy attorney of my choosing. The projected royalty income from a future natural gas lease would flow to me directly. In exchange for this arrangement, I agreed to purchase Caleb and Renata's shares of the surface deed and negotiated value, a value that acknowledged the farm's actual worth as a working agricultural operation, not as resort development land. The purchase price was structured as a 10-year payment plan drawn from farm income and, potentially, future mineral royalties. Caleb and Renata would be made whole, not by a developer's windfall, but by the actual honest value of what the farm produces, which is, it turns out, more than enough. There was one additional condition that I required, and I want to tell you about it, because it matters to me more than any of the financial arrangements. My grandfather, Walter James Decker, is buried at the corner of the East Pasture, under a limestone marker he had placed himself during the last summer of his life. The grave had no legal protection. It was simply there on the land, understood by everyone in the family to be sacred, without anyone having taken the legal step of making it formally so. I had Caroline Marsh file the paperwork to designate the cemetery plot as a protected family burial ground under Tennessee state law. The designation makes it permanently exempt from any future surface use that would disturb or diminish it. It gives it the legal protection that my grandfather's memory deserved and never had. When the papers were signed, I walked out to the east pasture alone in the early evening and stood by the limestone marker for a while. The light was doing that thing it does in October in hill country, Tennessee, coming in sideways and low, turning everything the color of something almost too beautiful to look at directly. The ridge was gold. The stubble field was silver. The sky above the bluffs was a color that has no name in any language I know. I put my hand on the limestone. He knew what he was doing. I said, all of it. Walter James Decker had separated the mineral rights from the surface deed in 1979. My father had found that separation and, 11 years ago, transferred it to my name. 2 generations of men who had understood the land had worked together, across time, to make sure that the land would remain in the hands of the person who understood it best. They had done it quietly. They had done it without telling me, without asking me, without making a production of it. They had done it the way farmers do the most important things. Carefully, patiently, without performance. The field was still. The hawk that works the updraft along the ridge was gone for the day. The cattle were moving toward the barn in that unhurried, inevitable way that cattle have, each one sure of where it belongs. Everything was exactly as it should be. Section 8, the legacy. It is late spring now. The south field is planted in alfalfa and doing well. The cattle herd is healthy and over our target weight for the season. The well pump in the south barn reset correctly in February without incident, because I reset it on schedule way I always have. The farmhouse got a new porch roof this spring. I hired a local carpenter named James who had worked with my grandfather in the 1980s and who accepted the job with the quiet satisfaction of a man doing something that needed to be done. The new porch boards are white oak, the same species as the original, because I went to the trouble of finding a mill that still cuts it that way. My grandfather would have approved of the inconvenience. Caleb came by last month, unannounced, on a Saturday afternoon. He walked the property, which he has not done in years with any real attention. He walked the east pasture and the hay fields and stopped at the edge of the south orchard, where the scrub cedar has been coming out slowly. I have been working on it, a little at a time, with an eye toward bringing the orchard back over the next 5 years. He stood at the edge of what will become the orchard again and looked at the cleared section, at the young grass coming up to the cleared ground, and he said, "This is going to take a long time." "Most things worth doing do," I said. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I didn't know what you did here. I mean, I knew, but I didn't actually understand it." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Miriam." I believed him. It was not a cheap apology. He had lost the windfall he thought he was getting, and he had discovered that his investment in a transaction he believed he understood had been built on someone else's incomplete information. He had lost something real, and from that loss, something honest had emerged. I told him I accepted his apology. We walked back to the house together in the kind of quiet that is possible between people who have finally said the true thing and don't need to add more words to it. Renata has not been back to the farm. I don't know if she will be. That is between her and herself, and I hold no grievance about it. What she does with her share of the trust income is her business. What she does with the memories she carries from this place, of our grandfather, of our parents, of the years we all lived here before the world pulled us in different directions, that is hers to carry however she needs to carry it. I carry mine in the work. That is where I have always carried it. There is a particular quality to early morning on a working farm that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hasn't lived it. It is the quality of things that are exactly what they are. The cattle are exactly cattle. The hay field is exactly a hay field. The sky over the ridge is exactly that sky on that morning, in a light that will never happen in precisely that way again. My grandfather used to be out in the east pasture before first light, checking the fence line, which didn't need to be checked every day, but which he checked every day anyway, because checking was how he knew the place was his, not in the legal sense, but in the only sense that matters, the sense that comes from showing up, from paying attention, from being willing to do the unglamorous work of maintenance, when the world would rather look at the results than the process. I do the same. Every morning, before the light is full, I walk the east pasture fence line. I look at the land. I listen to what it tells me. I carry my grandfather in that walk, and I carry my father, and I carry the understanding that what I am is the person who stayed. It was not a consolation prize. It was the whole inheritance. The house stands behind me when I walk the fence line, white in the morning light, solid on its limestone foundation, a century old and unworried about it. My grandfather built it to last. My father kept it. I will keep it after them. The land does not need dramatic gestures. It needs daily attention. It needs someone who will show up every morning before the light is full and be present to what it is and what it is trying to become. It found that in my grandfather. It found that in my father, imperfectly in his way. It found it in me. $9. Let them think that's what it was worth. The land knows different. And now, finally, so does everyone else. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.